Welcome, listeners, to a realm where shadows dance and whispers echo. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and this is Quills and Chills, the podcast that brings you face to face with the masterminds behind the macabre. In each episode, we journey into the minds of horror writers and filmmakers to uncover the secrets lurking within their tales of terror. From classic tales to modern nightmares, we'll traverse the corridors of the human psyche and unravel the threads of dread that keep us turning the pages or sitting out there in the dark. Welcome to Quills and Chills. Hello and welcome back to Quills and Chills. I'm your host, Rick Clifton, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Linwood Barclay. He is an international best-selling author whose novels have sold millions of copies worldwide, with several of them having been adopted for both film and television. He is an Arthur Ellis Award winner, a Shamus Award finalist, and one of the most recognizable voices in modern suspense fiction. But today, he is here to talk about his latest adventure into the supernatural, Whistle, and I am very excited to talk about this book. So welcome to the show, Linwood.
Nice to be here. Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So before we get started and talk about this book, which I loved, I did want to sort of talk about your path to writing. I'd love to get to know a little bit about you. Your path to becoming this best-selling novelist is very inspiring to me. And I wonder if you could sort of talk about moving through your time as a humor columnist at the Toronto Star and eventually transitioning into full-time fiction writing.
Yeah, sure. I'll try not to make this too long a story. I mean, I was writing novels in my teens and early 20s, and I just figured as soon as I got out of university, I'd just be a best-selling novelist. The only problem was nobody wanted to publish me, and probably with good reason. You know, the books that I wrote then, they didn't get published, and I guess we can all be grateful. So I thought, well, where can you get paid money to write every day? And so I got a job at newspapers at the age of 22, and worked at some smaller papers, and then got to the Toronto Star, which was Canada's largest circulation paper. I got there in 1981, and I went in for an interview, hoping to get a reporting job. And they said, well, we don't need any reporters now. We're desperate for editors, copy editors. Do you have a lot of editing experience? And I said, sure. And so I was hired to work on the city desk and edit stories. And it turned out I was good at it. And so I was an editor in various capacities. I was a news editor, I was assistant city editor, I was a life section editor. I did all these editing jobs for, I guess, better part of 12 years. And then an opportunity came up to write a column, and I applied for that. And I started in 93, I started writing 3 columns a week, allegedly a humor column. I always feel like it needs to be kind of qualified, because if you read humor in a newspaper, and if nobody laughs, I don't know if it is a humor column. But if you write a terrible sports column, it's still a sports column, But I found that writing humor, writing satire in a newspaper comes with some perils, because people just think, well, if you read it in the paper, it must be true. And and I mean, I wrote, I just what's an example. I mean, remember when there was when the Mir space station, Russia said this station is circling the Earth. And I did a list one time of places to send your kids for summer camp. And I mentioned the Mir space station camp, but I said, but if you send your kids up there, dress them warmly because it's cold in space, and send them with send them with rolls of duct tape because there's a lot of holes in the hull. And I swear to God, a guy called the paper the next day and he said he didn't put in a phone number about how to get it. So it was risky writing humor. So, but I still had wanted to, I never really gave up on this idea of writing novels. And so, I've been doing the column for 11 years or more. And I wrote a comic thriller, which I found an agent. And anyway, Bantam published that. And that was a book called Bad Move. It was the first of 4 sort of comic thrillers with a character named Zach Walker. And so I wrote those 4 funny thrillers, all of which sold like 9 copies. And I was still doing 3 columns a week while I wrote a novel a year over 4 or 5 years. And then the 5th one was a book they called No Time for Goodbye. That one just hit the jackpot. That one was the single best-selling novel of the year in the UK in 2008, and we sold it to Germany and sold all these places. So that's when I decided to give up the day job and started writing books full time. I left the newspaper.
Well, I'm grateful for it, man. Let me tell you, because this is a great, great story. And it's very clear that you have a passion for writing. And so that being said, my next question for you is for someone who has a passion for horror. I'm kind of intrigued how you arrived at this supernatural story, knowing that this is your first foray into it. Is that correct?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, I did a book about 3 years ago that I think was it was more like a Michael Crichton thriller. It wasn't, it was a book called Look Both Ways, and it was about a place like Martha's Vineyard that a big company, sort of Tesla-like, says the best way to test self-driving cars is if every car on the road is one. So we're going to run a test on this community. Everybody surrenders their conventional vehicle to the mainland. We give everybody a self-driving car, and we run a test for a month. And it would have gone great if a virus hadn't gotten into the system and if the cars hadn't gotten homicidal. So it'd be like being on an island with 1,000 Christines, you know? So that book was a little out of my lane, but it was, like I said, it was more of a tech horror thriller. But Whistle is stepping a little further out of what I typically do, because I mean I write thrillers that are very much based in the real world with real people. And you know, when I was in my teens, I was writing sort of Ray Bradbury inspired short stories all the time. And so I don't know, when I had the idea for Whistle, I think probably, God, I think about 20 years ago, I actually had the idea for Whistle, but it wasn't a supernatural, it wasn't a horror story. It wasn't supernatural. There were no supernatural elements. It was about a guy who was obsessed with building model train layouts, and he breaks through the wall and expands his layout into the apartment next door when the people are away, and completely fills it. Everywhere you step would be tracks and trains and everything, just everywhere. And then the people come home and he has to kill them or something like that. And I just kind of parked that idea for a long time. I didn't do anything with it. And then like 30 years later, I went, you know, I could do something with that, but I'm going to do it differently. So.
Wow. And did you? I love this. So let's talk about Whistle. First of all, before we dive in, just tell us a little bit about what the story is about. Give us the elevator pitch, if you will.
Yeah, well, first of all, I describe Whistle as to do for toy trains what Chucky did for dolls. Mm-hmm. And you know, can you make toy trains scary? But it's also really, it's the story of this children's author illustrator named Annie, who does these children's books about this adorable penguin that travels the world. And Annie suffers a kind of double tragedy in that there's a horrible death that's linked to something that a child was inspired to do because of what was in her book. And on top of that, she's lost her spouse. And so she decides the best thing to do is to get the hell out of Manhattan, take her young son, Charlie, and rent a house in upstate New York. And when they get away, it's when they get to this house that Charlie finds locked away in a shed in a box, this box of old model toy trains, dusty old set. And after the discovery of this is when really strange, creepy things start to happen, like hearing, you know, trains going past in the night when the nearby train track is not even in commission anymore. And, you know, just terrible things start to happen. And also in the story, there's kind of two novels in one here, because we need to know, well, how did that box of trains get there? Where did that box of trains come from? And so there's a kind of parallel story that runs through the novel back and forth in chunks that takes place more than 20 years ago and focuses on a town not too far away from there and a little train shop that is doing just a gangbusters business of selling these particular sets. Then anybody who gets one, mayhem, as they say, mayhem ensues. And I mean, that's sort of the broad strokes of the book. And because, you know, I was thinking in horror, a lot of times toys are used in an interesting way in horror. I mean, they talked about Chucky being this nasty, malicious doll, going all the way back to, you know, when I was a kid and I saw that wonderful trilogy of terror thing with Karen Black, and there's that third story with the little whatever that fetish doll thing was. It's just with the big teeth, and even going further back in the 50s, there was something called the Rocking Horse Winter, where it was just one of these little toy rocking horses, and when the kid got on it, he started having visions, and so I thought, okay, and even most recently, think of like the monkey. The Stephen King short story turned into a film, and you've got this little monkey that is the little wind-up tall toy that starts banging its drum, and watch out when that happens. I thought, nobody's made trains scary. Can we do something? Is it possible to make toy trains creepy? And of course, I'm a lifelong model train nerd, and I have a layout in my basement that in a room is about 18 feet square and so forth. And it's not scary. I use it to kind of unwind. But I thought maybe there's a way to do this, and you'll be the judge. I mean, readers will be the judge. I thought, is it just going to seem silly, or is it going to be creepy? And so far, this consensus seems to be creepy.
It's creepy and it's fantastic. And I thought it was going to go one way and it went somewhere else completely. And I just love how this story sort of unfolded from the beginning.
I don't know if you can do it without doing spoilers, but I'd love to know what way you thought it was going to go, or if you can hint at it.
I thought, let me try and say this without spoilers. And if I have to edit it, I will. But I thought it was going to be kind of a ghost story.
Oh, yeah.
And it turned out not to be that. It was something else. I don't think that's a spoiler to say that. I think where it went was, I mean, I couldn't put it down, man. I was like, okay, I need another chapter. I don't care if it's 2:00 in the morning. I gotta have another chapter out of this. So it just, it was a true, it was what you call a page turner for me.
And, I think I had more fun. I mean, I don't know. I've lost count. I think that might be my 25th or 26th book. And I think I had more fun writing it than just about any other book I've done. And I think part of that's because when you write horror and supernatural, like when you write a conventional thriller, all the clues, all the setups, all the things, they have to fit together like a Swiss watch. Like it has to be believable. The plot, you can't jam square pegs into round holes. You've got to make it, if the cliche is organic, I guess. But when you are writing horror supernatural, I felt like there were some of the restrictions came off. Like I can do something really crazy here, and I don't really have to explain myself, if you know what I mean. I can just do it.
I know, it was fantastic. And that was my question for you, is like, how was the writing process different for this from your other types of work? And I think you just sort of answered that a little bit. But
kind of it just felt like you took the reins off. I still think that for a really good horror novel, there have to be rules that apply within that context or within that world. So it still has to make sense. It has to hold together. But you can kind of be more fanciful. You can think, well, I just want to have somebody blow up like this or do this or that. I think I can get away with that. And so I think that's part of the reason why it was so much fun to write. And the other thing that was interesting in writing it is I had done about 80 pages of this book taking place in the present day. And I thought, well, how am I going to get in all this stuff that happened more than 20 years ago? And that's going to be a lot of backstory, or who's going to and then it just sort of I had this kind of moment and thought, there's 2 books in one here. I have to tell all of that backstory in great detail, and alternating between the present and the past. That's the only way to tell the story.
I loved it. That was another one of my favorite things. There are a couple of authors that have done it really well as well. C.J. Cook is one of them as well. She's done alternating timelines, but I loved yours because I love how this sort of unfolds across 2 timelines, and your description is perfect. It's like 2 stories in one, but they both sort of intertwine and come together at some point. And that's what I love, is that it's all connected. And I just, so what was that approach, and what were the challenges in sort of trying to tell that story from 2 different, granted they weren't 200 years apart, but still, like, what were the challenges in telling those 2 stories and bringing them together?
I think that telling both stories is what got rid of a lot of the challenges. It's just that allowed me to really dig into it, and better than half of the book is with my children's illustrator and the Annie, and then the other part is with this police chief Harry. And to me, that telling Harry's story as well was what solved all my problems in doing this book. And I think it also allowed me to build more suspense and more tension in what happened in the past. And I think when you take your time in a horror story to sort of slowly build to what you're getting towards, when you finally get to what's really happening, it's more believable. I always kind of use the example. I was a huge fan of the show Lost. Even if you hated the ending, I still loved Lost. And I thought, if in the first episode they told us, yeah, there's 2 islands and there's this and there's a smoke monster and there's all this other stuff, and if they told you that in the first episode, you'd go, yeah, that's nuts. And but it took us in slowly. I mean, first of all, we're just people who crashed on an island, and then it's by the end, it's like, well, there's something in the woods there, but there's so much that we don't get told right away, so that when we finally find out what's happening, we're like, okay, I'm ready for this answer now. I can tell you, I'll believe it.
What I really like too is that it's exactly what you just said, actually. Like, one didn't really necessarily see how it linked up to the other until you got to the point where both points cross. And I loved it. I thought it was really well done, the build up to that. I want to talk a little bit about.
I'm afraid of giving a spoiler to my own thing, but I also liked doing something hugely dramatic with a main character, and because even that was, I think maybe that's too, because it's a standalone, but it's just, there was just more freedom. I can do what I want to this person because I don't need them again later.
Yes, you did that quite a bit. I loved it.
Yeah.
I want to talk about Annie a little bit, and I want to I think maybe back up a little bit and talk about her career as a children's book author and illustrator, and also her husband's career as well as an animator. I don't really talk about it a lot in this show, but my daytime job is in animation, and I have I've never seen, I can't recall a story I've read any recently where any character was sort of rooted or worked in animation as their career. And your love and attention to this medium really leapt off the page to me, and I just wanted to say that. And
that's interesting. I hadn't heard that before. That's cool.
And I was, when I was reading up about you, I knew that your father, I think, was an illustrator as well. So I was wondering if that was sort of some of the inspiration that came into this.
Well, maybe, perhaps, considering that, Annie was a person who was making a living as an illustrator, and that's what my dad did. And I mean, if I can fly out of the frame for a minute here, I'm just looking up over here at the desk here. Okay, don't go away. Here I come back. Right back. So, like, my father was working in advertising, and he was a commercial illustrator. And so back in the 1950s, early 60s, all of the car ads that you saw in magazines and brochures were illustrations. And he drew those cars. And the book that I talked about earlier, Look Both Ways, about all the cars that run amok. There's one old car in that novel. It's an old Cadillac. And we had a picture of a Cadillac on the title page. And that Cadillac is actually an illustration, and my dad drew it. So that's what he did. And so I'm not quite sure what point I decided that that's what Annie needed to be, but it just worked. It's funny because a lot of times when I do interviews like this, people say, well, where did the idea come for Annie to be an illustrator? And I think, I'm not really sure. It just happened. But also the fact that I thought someone like that, it made sense that if she went to art school, the person that she would meet would also be an artist. And, you want to make a living. And so he works in animation. And of course, I live in Toronto, which is 20 miles away from Sheridan College in Oakville, which is where there's a huge animation school program there. And I grew up loving cartoons. So, I mean, it just all kind of came together, you know.
Naturally inspired, as it were.
You know, I just, as a kid, I just loved, you know, I loved all the Bugs Bunny, Roadrunner, all those kind of cartoons. And yet there were some I can remember I still really hated. I could never watch Woody Woodpecker. I hated those cartoons. I didn't like Popeye, but it was the Warner Brothers stuff, just, and Rocky and Bullwinkle. Like, I love that stuff.
Yep. And real quick before we move off of it, just about your dad being an illustrator for cars. Before I went to college, I did 1 year in community college and studied commercial art, where I did a lot of car design for Ford Mustangs that were hand drawn and things like that. So I have an appreciation for his work there as well.
And it's very likely that at some point you saw some work that was his. You know.
Yep, I'm sure.
There are a lot of there's a couple of Facebook groups that I belong to that are devoted to posting images of old automotive art, and every once in a while I'll look through them and think, oh, I have that one. I have that one framed downstairs. You know, we have that.
I love it. I should probably go and find one of those groups. I bet I could probably find some early inspiration work that we worked on as well. So I would love to talk a little bit about some of the themes in this book. Well, I think there's probably one big one, and that is grief and trauma. But they sort of come off to me as characters in their own right. But what I really found compelling was how you showed the way that these experiences can act as sort of change agents, forcing maybe some resilience or even strength in the face of something absolutely terrifying. Mm-hmm. This question's probably a little more general in nature, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you feel like grief or trauma reshapes a character's journey.
Well, I mean, there's those are life-changing moments, you know, and I think, you know, whenever I'm writing thrillers or whatever it is, I always feel like what drives a story is that there's something really big that's at stake. And maybe that thing that was big that was stake was something that has happened instead of trying to stop it from happening, or so, you know, rescuing a loved one, or you know, saving a kidnapped kid or something like that. But a lot of times those big pivotal moments have already happened, and they are, and it's that grief that comes along with it that is what drives this character to change. I mean, that all sounds like gobbledygook. I guess I think. Look, I mean, I think maybe it's just personal, and it's just something that's ingrained in me. I mean, I lost my dad when I was 16, and I was in the room when he died. I watched him. I saw him die. I was there, and we had a sort of family business of a cottage resort trailer park thing out in Ontario. And my parents bought this business after photography killed commercial illustration. My dad, what he was good at was nobody wanted, so they bought this place. And so at the age of 16, not only did I lose my dad, but I basically took over running the family business. And so that was kind of in my life. That's kind of the dividing point in my whole life. There was all the stuff up to then, and then at that point, everything changed for me. And maybe it's some kind of unconscious level. That's what's happening with characters. I mean, when you have a trauma, it makes you kind of reassess everything, or you have to change your outlook. You have to grow. For me, I had to grow up. You know, I didn't have these, you know, these years between like 16 and 20 of going out and binge drinking and partying and doing all that sort of stuff. I was helping run a business. I was looking after my mom. I was looking after a schizophrenic brother. I was doing all this stuff, and it all happened then. So maybe when I'm doing a story, there's like I can appreciate how there are these pivotal moments in our lives that just change everything.
And in terms of Annie's journey through that, what I particularly loved was how it wasn't immediately fixed, right? This was something that stayed with her through the entire journey. And it's not something that I've always seen in a lot of stories. It's like, but it resonated with her throughout the entire story. And I'm being cryptic, but there's some stuff that happens at the end that was just really great. So
I appreciate that. And I think, you know, one of the things that I've tried to do in all of my fiction is especially because I'm not, for a while I did, but I don't write a series. So when something happens to my characters, when some extraordinary event happens to ordinary people, this will be the biggest thing that ever happens to them. And they won't be able to slough it off, like this is huge. It's not like, I was a huge fan when I was a kid of the detective show Mannix. And, Mannix could the private detective, he could stumble into a circumstance, and all of a sudden he has to shoot a guy because he was going to, beat up somebody, shoots and kills them. And in the next scene, the cops are interviewing him saying, well, it was justifiable. And he says, well, can I go now? Because I'm on a fishing trip, and it's like he just killed a guy an hour and a half ago. And it's now he's going to be late meeting his buddies going fishing. And it was all sort of, oh, well, and I still love those shows, but it's like, those kind of events, they affect you.
Yeah, they're life-changing. So can we talk about the antagonist? I don't know how much you would consider a spoiler if we can say who he is, but it's Mr. Chu for me. I love, he is, I was wondering if you could talk, I should probably edit that out. Sorry, let me ask it this way. Let's talk about Mr. Chu for a second. Can you share some insights on this particular character, and is there any symbolism that he brings to the story?
Well, once we go into the past and we start meeting the police chief, Harry Cook, and it's a sort of small town, and there's a new shop opens up on the main street, and it's one of these sort of places like, when did that store open? You know how you can walk past?
I love that.
You can walk past the store 100 times and never notice it's there until one day you realize, I need to get my shoes fixed. And somebody says, well, there's a shoe repair place right down there. And you probably walked past it a million times, and you have, but you never needed it, never noticed. So they're like, when did this toy train shop come? Like, it just seemed to just appear one day. And it's run by a fellow whose name is actually Edwin Nabler, is the fellow's name, but he has a little kind of persona for running this train store. He has this stupid, railway hat, and then the coveralls and the little various patches from all the railways logos. And he goes by Mr. Chu, so it's Choo-Choo's trains or whatever. And he may seem like just a jolly, lovable little fellow selling these wares, these train sets, but he's really something else. And he's not particularly human either. And there are moments in the book where certain characters are afforded glimpses of him in his true form, and it's not good and not nice. And he's a pretty scary guy, and his mission is kind of, he's kind of part of nature. He's there to kind of restore order in the universe. Like, we'll never know what things are good if we don't have evil to compare them to. And so that's kind of a service that he provides, because if he can make certain bad things happen, that's kind of offers a little balance in the universe.
So that was probably one of the things I love the most, is what you did with the balance, right? Because you always hear you've got to balance the bad with the good, and you've always got the force for good and all of that. I can't remember the last time I've met a force for bad that balances the bad against the good. And I was like, I love this I love the flip of that. I thought that was really well done.
The first draft of that book is not very different than the final draft, but what I added in the rewrite is I spent a little more time talking about this thing I came up with that I called the sliver. And the sliver is this kind of other bit of a dimension that exists in the world that usually you can't even see it. It's not quite there. You can kind of catch it. It's like the light catches it the right way. And it's working in the sliver are these forces or these entities that try to restore balance. And they do it in lots of different ways. Some of those things that are working in the sliver, they would bring down planes, or they would make a piano drop onto somebody's head on the sidewalk. And Mr. Chu's job is to sell these particular toy train sets and that they themselves are infused with a kind of evil and will do their part, to bring this kind of balance. It's based on a true story, I should add.
I love it. From your own childhood, perhaps?
Mhm.
So, all right, without giving too much away, is there a particular moment or a scene that you're most excited for readers to experience? And before you answer that, I'm gonna give you mine. But this is gonna take a minute because I have quite a few. So there's so many moments, but I think for me, it started with the first introduction of Pierce the Penguin and that whole story around that. I'm gonna talk in spoilers here. I'm not gonna give things away, but sort of what happened with him learning to fly. To the revelation of Mr. Chu, or who Edwin really was, which was absolutely, like I said, one of my favorite sort of revelations. To the discovery of the den by Chief Harry Cook. But all that aside, because these are things that are happening along the story, and I was like, that's it. That's my moment. That's it. That's my moment. All of that went away and I'm going to talk, this is going to be real vague, but hopefully you know what I'm talking about. All of that went away when I call it my biggest slam the book closed and scream at you moment, was the discovery near the end that was tied to someone from the past. And hopefully you know what I mean by that. Because
it was something that I might wear here if I didn't.
Might be. And I, first of all, because I had forgotten all about that, right? Yep. And then it came to me out of nowhere. And having, reading a lot of books, working in film, working in television, you learn to spot the callbacks pretty early on. And you had so many callbacks in this story that I didn't see coming right away. And I'm like, oh my God, like you do that quite a bit and you do it very well. But
that moment, I knew really early on I was going to do, and I couldn't wait to get to it because I had to kind of write 200 pages to get back to it, and I couldn't wait. But my favorite moment in the whole book is the bathtub scene.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
I think that is my favorite moment in the whole book. I think it's the creepiest, scariest moment in the whole book. I just can't wait for people to think, what the heck is he talking about? But it's the bathtub scene and I think the scene very close to the end when our good friend Mr. Nabler is knocked back and knocks all of these model tanker cars off his layout. I think those are the two moments that I love. But for sure, my favorite scene is the bathtub.
And the knocking down of the trains leads to another callback moment with another character in the modern, and not the modern, but the most up-to-date storyline. And I loved how that came together too. And oh gosh, it was riddled with all these callbacks that I just loved. And when you do it that well, that it just sort of naturally placed in there, it was just I loved it. So.
And there was an incident that is described in the book that's real, of a train derailment that happened in Canada in, I think, 79 or 80 or 81, I forgot now, where a whole series of chlorine-filled tanker cars derailed outside of Toronto. And the fear was that they would explode. And if they did, chlorine displaces oxygen and everything in the area, that everybody would be killed. And I worked on that story as a starting out reporter. So, I covered it. And it was a miracle because none of those tankers blew up, but they evacuated an entire city, like outside of Toronto's other close by city. Everybody had to leave. 500,000 people were evacuated for 5 days. And that story had always was sitting in the back of my head for a long time. And I thought, I'm going to use that. There's some inspiration from that for this book.
Yeah. When you were covering that story, did you see the town, whether it was in photos or in real life?
I went into it. I went into parts of the area that had been evacuated because they were the photographer and I, we wanted to talk to people who didn't follow the order and didn't leave. So we snuck kind of into one of the outer reaches of it, and it was just there's just nobody. It was like the end of a movie thing. And we see a light on in the house. We knock on the door and say, "Hey, how come you didn't leave?" And they said, "Oh, it's nothing. No, it's not."
It's always one, right?
and I mean, it's funny from from the apartment that my wife and I lived in at the time. It was like midnight on the second day, midnight, and we looked out our balcony window, and just going right past our place was a convoy of like 100 ambulances with all the lights off, going up to the hospital up the street. And we said, we're going to evacuate that hospital because they think we might be in the outer ranges. And so we got dressed, we ran, we spent the whole night in the hospital watching them move people out. It was great fun.
You have a morbid sense of humor, and I love it. So what was the most challenging thing for you to write in this book?
Well, I think the challenge was, I think this kind of goes back to something I said at the beginning. Can you write a story like this and not have it seem silly? Like, can you take the concept of sort of evil infused toys that are trains and make that scary? And that was always my worry through writing the whole book. And that, and the fact that worried whether my publishers would go, this is really weird. This is too different. That was another worry. But based on the reactions like yours and others, I think I got over that hurdle.
Well, I would say you did, from my point of view. I loved it. Like I said, it was a real page turner for sure. It was hard to put down for me. So
it's also probably the longest book I've ever written. I usually write books that come in around between 95 and 105,000 words, kind of in there. And I think this came at it over about 120, which is still, like a short story compared to some of the greatest books Stephen King has written. But it's still long for me. It was a long book for me.
It's interesting you say that, because I did look at it. I'm like, okay, this is probably about 150 pages longer than most books that I read. But as I was reading through it, I didn't feel that at all. I mean, it just, like I said,
I never like to get bogged down, and I think that comes from working in newspapers for 30 years, is that, you have to justify, why is this here? Like, if there's not a reason for this paragraph to be here, then get rid of it. And I'm not the kind of writer who gets bogged down in description. I just kind of want to write what's happening and what people are saying. And I just feel stories have to have a sense of momentum. They just have to move. I don't want you to get bogged down anywhere.
Yeah, and the movement's truly there for sure. So Linwood, what's next on the horizon for you? I know you mentioned in the acknowledgments this might not be your last time exploring a darker world. So I'm kind of curious what you might not be able to talk about. I can certainly see how a revisit to this universe might play out based on how the story ended. So
I think, much will depend on how the book is received. If it sinks like a stone, and I'm like a lot of writers, I am a complete pessimist. I'm the glass is half empty kind of guy. So I always expect every book that I write to go and just be completely sink like a stone on day 2. So maybe that won't happen. And if it doesn't, that'd be great. And so, but whether I do more books like this will really be determined by that. And I have at least 2 other ideas that I think are not if they're horror, supernatural, or more sci-fi, or what you might call them, but they're different. But I actually have 2 books kind of done, two future novels that are the first drafts are done. They haven't gone to my editors to been at it yet, but they're more in line with what people have come to expect from me. And so, and if Whistle's a hit, I could take one of those and maybe shove it ahead for another year and do something else in the interim. But we in this household at the moment, our daughter is about to have twins. I expect the rest of the year to be complete chaos, helping out. So I wanted to get another book done, which I finished yesterday, and now I can coast for a year.
Awesome. Well, congratulations on the twins, and congratulations on getting the book done. And if I have anything to say about it, Whistle is already ahead.
That's nice to hear. The next book I'm writing, that I think will come out, as if all going well, is, I don't know if you know this term, but it's about porch pirates. It's the people who steal your Amazon packages off your front stoop before you can get to it.
I hope this is a nice revenge story.
Well, but where I live, I just don't want to have anything delivered to the house, if I can avoid it, because it's too often these things get snatched before you can get there. So I thought, there's a story. I'm gonna do porch pirates.
All right. Well, I'm excited for that one. I'm looking for it. So the book is called Whistle. It is available everywhere in the United States and Canada on May 20th, and in the UK in, what was it, June 5th? Sorry.
5th, yep.
Okay, great. All right. And as we always like to say here at Quills and Chills, please go and support your local bookstores whenever and wherever possible. So, Linwood, how can our audience find you online?
Okay, so apparently everybody says, are you on Instagram? And I am, but I never could figure out how to use it. Every time my wife looks at something on Instagram, she holds the phone to me. She says, "Hey, look at this! Look, it's gone. Where does it go? I don't understand this." But I'm on there. I have stayed on X despite qualms about it, but I am still there. I'm on Bluesky. I'm on Threads. I'm on Facebook. I've got a website, linwoodbarclay.com. So I'm out there somewhere.
Well, great. I will make sure to include in the show notes version all of those sites, and for the video version, it'll be up on the screen as well. So, Linwood, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. Like I said, I could not write about this story anymore. It just really was, as I said, for the third time now, just a complete page turner that I could not put down. So it is a winner in my eyes. So,
well, thank you for that. I much appreciate it.
All right, guys. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Quills and Chills. Thanks for joining me on another episode of Quills and Chills. I hope you enjoyed our deep dive into the mysterious and the haunted. If you're enjoying the show, don't forget to support us by subscribing on your preferred podcast platform and leaving us a rating or review, because your feedback helps keep those chills running down both our spines. And feel free to share the show with your favorite fellow horror enthusiasts. Also, if you guys have any spooky stories, strange encounters, or paranormal experiences of your own, I'd love to hear them. Reach out to me on social media or email me at quillsandchillspodcast@gmail.com. Who knows? Your story might end up on a very special episode. Anyway, thanks for listening, and I will see you back here next time on Quills and Chills. Bye, y'all.